Welcome to the 24th edition of the Time of the Writer International Festival, presented by the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Centre for Creative Arts. My name is Ashraf Jawardine. I'm a playwright and I've written columns for the Pink Tongue and for Creative Feel magazine. Let's meet our panel. You will see her in, I'm not sure what view we're in, but Dereline D. Marco is a lecturer in the Department of Media Studies at Wits University. She holds a PhD from the Department of Film and Television Studies at Warwick University. Hello, Dee. Can we get a hi from you?
Hello, hi everyone.
Hi, there we go.
Hi.
Welcome, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Next up, we have my old friend from Cape Town, Mary Watson, who now lives in the west coast of Ireland. Mary has a PhD from the University of Cape Town, where she taught for many years. She won the Caine Prize in 2006 and writes contemporary fiction, young adult fantasy, and short stories. And her writing has been translated into Dutch, Italian, Japanese, Arabic, Czech, and German. Hey, Mary, how's it going?
Hello, hi, good to be here tonight.
Thank you for joining us. Ruth Ramsden-Carlser is next. Hi, Ruth. Ruth is the founder and co-convener of the Oxford Queer Studies Network, a research associate at the University of Manchester's Centre on Dynamics of Ethnicity, and a PhD candidate in the English faculty at the University of Oxford, where she holds the inaugural Stewart Hall doctoral studentship in association with Merton College, the Oxford Research Centre in Humanities, and the Stewart Hall Foundation. What I haven't covered in Ruth's bio is that in 2018, she judged the Miss Western Cape Gay competition, and I'm very envious of that. Hey, Ruth, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ashraf, thanks for having me.
The overall theme for this year's Time with the Writer is the writer, witness, canary in the mine, or testifier. The theme is inspired by an essay written by author Daisy Hernandez, in which she states, while it may well be that no book has ever prevented genocide or fascism, we still have a necessity for literature to testify to the political conditions of our lives, not only so that we might have a record of those we have lost, but also that we might have a reason to gather with others to read and to continue resisting. In response to that overarching theme, this panel, entitled Dysphoria, Sex, Gender, and Trauma in African Literature, considers the role of the writer in reinscribing trauma and dysphoria in the construction of gendered characters who reinforce rather than challenge the ideological hegemony of the dominant order. I asked each of our panelists to consider the following provocation. Is that a boy or a girl? How can we tell? What if we can't tell? Do we need to know? What about people who aren't entirely male or female? Which pronouns should we use? Is gender expression, gender identity, and gender presentation the same thing? Are all non-binary, genderqueer, or gender non-conforming people transgender? Why should transgender only be used as an adjective, but never as a noun? Why is transgendered grammatically incorrect? When did singular they become a legitimate pronoun? Last year's the answer, but does it matter? Does any of it matter? So let's start with your thoughts on that provocation, Ruth.
Hi again. Thank you so much to the festival organisers, and particularly to Ashraf for inviting me to participate. I'm very grateful to be part of this festival alongside so many brilliant writers. I do feel like I need to come clean at this point about the fact that I'm very much not a brilliant writer myself, although what I lack in that department, I do try to make up for as an extremely enthusiastic reader. So, enthusiastically reading your provocations, Ashraf, to some of which I'm now responding, it strikes me that they strike to the very heart of what it means that we all come into gender partly through language. I say this in the sense that gender is instituted through a stylized repetition of acts, and what forms those acts can take is determined by a social reality that is in part constituted through language. So I'd say that none of us is entirely male or female, as you put it, since these are unattainable ideals reinscribed through our own imperfect performances. Ultimately, I think your questions are about autonomy, or the varying degrees of agency any of us is able to claim when it comes to gender. Given we enter into this pre-existing system of meaning, our agency is constrained at best, although many of us are invested in the project of making it less so. But of course, language has always been used to deny people their autonomy and their humanity. So the current English trend of mispronouncing others extends at least back to when enslaved people were described with the pronoun it, for example. This use of language to deny others' humanity is why the word transgender should not be used as a noun, as you note, and why transgender or trans is an adjective that has to be affixed to a human descriptor, such as person, man, or woman, rather than squished up against it as though to imply that there was such a thing as a trans woman, one word that is an entirely different sort of person to a woman, rather than a descriptor of the manner in which that particular woman came into her gender, as all of us do. Given we all come into gender through existing systems of meaning, then, the issue of how categories of difference are constituted and established as norm through language has a direct and important link to which of us is able to appear in public space and to be understood as worthy of others' respect and of protection. So, I do think that there's a responsibility that writers have in that by creating worlds linguistically, they are recreating or playing with these systems of possibility. More importantly for me, as someone who is just an enthusiastic reader, I think that we readers have the same responsibility in engaging with and circulating these systems of possibility. Gender diverse people have, of course, always existed and have often been particularly marginalized and disenfranchised within colonial modernity. As marginalized people always do, they have created their own systems of possibility, and this work is often not accessible to us as formally published literature. I think about this in my own academic work on the CUPE photographic collection. Many of you will have heard about the 2018 exhibition, I'm sure. If not, I'd really recommend checking it out on the website of the Queer Archive, which is at Wits in Joburg. So I argue that while living in District 6, before and during its destruction, CUPE and her friends used photography as a relatively accessible creative format to inscribe or reimagine their own set of conditions in ways that are as politically and artistically important as the brilliant literature we've been engaging with all week. Now, I want to just end briefly on your question about the use of the singular they. I'm sure that many of us are aware that its first recorded use was in 1375, and that even the most regressive people continue to use it regularly and naturally. If I said that someone from Telkom phoned while you were out, for example, you might ask, what did they want? And this question would not attract the same sort of outrage with which the use of the singular they by gender diverse people tends to be met by faux language purists. Language changes all the time. About 13 years ago, I started telling my friends that I would write on their wall, meaning their Facebook page. Since then, I'll write on your wall has come to sound more like what it did a decade and a half ago, a rather formal threat of domestic graffiti. So language does change all the time, although the singular they is not the best example of rapid linguistic change, given it's been in use for over half a millennium now. But only changes that are perceived as threatening to the status quo get so policed in the name of language itself. Of course, the status quo is not working. It's not actually working for any of us. And even those who claim to defend language seem to be confused about the nature of language. But as an enthusiastic reader, I really do believe that one especially powerful weapon that we have is literature, because what is literature really, if not the imaginative exploration of what language might yet do and what might yet be possible?
What a lovely response to what felt like quite a garbled provocation at the time. I sort of emptied my head to frame this particular panel. But I do love what you're saying in terms of language opening up possibilities. And I think that that segues quite neatly and in a lovely way to Mary Watson, the author on the panel, who loves to write into imagined, mythological, sacred, alternative spaces. Mary, your thoughts on that initial provocation I shared?
I found it really interesting, and I suppose my position is that I'm going to speak from now is very much as a writer. So as somebody who's actually thinking through some of these questions and some of these thoughts as I sit down to write a book, and trying to grapple with some of these concerns and questions and issues that I might not have thought about 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and to make a space for voices that might not have been as audible as they are now several years ago. So what I actually have at this point is mostly questions myself. I mean, I don't feel like I have answers in any kind of significant way, but I do have questions, and I think that questions are often more important than answers, because as we continue to ask ourselves questions, we continue to think through, and often answers can bring us to places of resolutions where, you know, that might not be the appropriate response. It might be better to just keep questioning, to keep probing, to keep pushing for answers. So in a previous incarnation of myself, I was an academic, and I one of the topics of my PhD thesis was about trauma and storytelling. So it's something that I've had a long-standing interest in. And earlier this week, I was reading Elliot Page's interview in Time magazine. And one of the things that really resonated for me was him saying that as a child, he would picture himself as a boy in these imaginary games, and that this was a way to be freed from this discomfort of how other people saw him as a girl. It really struck me, this idea of being pinned by the gaze of others, and worse, to be pinned as something that you are not, and how very difficult this must be. In Elliot Page's case, it caused depression and anxiety and panic attacks. And in a related way, Juno Dawson also writes about how, knowing as a child she was a girl, and she would ask, you know, when would she turn into a girl, because that was her expectation, because that's what she felt inside, and how she dreamt of it as a teenager. And it made me really think about how traumatic this disconnect must be between how you're perceived and what you know you are. And it's how this is in itself a kind of chronic trauma that's increasingly built up over time. And then in addition, there are other traumas that we're thinking of at the same time. So for example, there's the ways in which trans rights have been appropriated into the political rights stirring of culture wars. So you find that trans rights have become an issue for destabilizing, for distracting, and how this then in itself becomes another source of trauma, where people's existence becomes a tool or a weapon in some cases. And then in addition to hate crime and discrimination, there's a lot of potential for trauma here. And I think as writers and artists, the trauma in our experiences feed our work. This is not to say that we're forever doomed to write out our issues. In my own experience, whether I like it or not, my trauma is a kind of fuel. So I find that the act of writing changes the trauma, it transmutes it, it transforms it, it becomes something different. So for example, in my 2018 book, The Wren Hunt, at a very subterranean level, it's a book about the losses that I experienced after moving from South Africa. But most readers would assume that it's a book about warring Druidic factions in Ireland and kissing, and a girl who gets sent on an undercover mission. But underneath, if you go deep enough, you'll find that that trauma of my own experiences kind of, you know, feeds the story, and it is there. But truly, this is the only way I could have written of this experience of myself. So what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that I think for me, it would be more helpful to see more ordinary stories. And this is what I would really like as a reader and a writer, featuring trans characters. I'd like to see trans characters summoning demons, accidentally opening magic portals, going on journeys to discover magic things.
Mary, all the time.
Sorry?
They do. Open portals all the time.
Falling in love, going to the ball, you know, putting the glass slipper on. There's room for books that explicitly explore identity issues, and these books fulfill a necessary function. But ordinary stories about trans characters or gay characters or Black characters have the power to make what might seem other to some people, normal. And this is the binding power of stories. So but then why is this not happening, and why is this not happening enough? It's complicated. And I think that the shift to opening up these voices has to primarily come from publishing. But for me as a writer, the terrain to navigate here has to be done really carefully. There's been a lot of heated discussions around the idea of own voices and stay in your lane, which highlights who tells what story. And this can be seen, for example, in the backlash that Janine Cummins and Flatiron received for American Dirt. And I would think that many would agree that the priority is for publishing to make space for people who have particular experiences to tell these stories. But is that enough? Representation matters. People need to see themselves in stories. And for so long, it has been the same old. in recent years, there's been a real invigoration. For example, we find much more African and Asian-inspired fantasy instead of the usual European medieval fantasy. And it really feels that now is the time that for these shifts to happen. And more than that, the act of writing itself is inherently transgressive. When we write, we become murderers, we become adulterers, we become psychopaths, and without any of the real world consequences. And this is certainly a large part of the appeal for me, is that I can transgress, I can cross these boundaries. There's an essay by Kit de Waal which uses the very memorable line, "Don't dip your pen in someone else's blood." And I think this is a really good measure. So for myself, I want to write inclusive stories, but I want to write these inclusive stories without exploiting the trauma of another marginalized group. So that is the terrain, and this is the kind of places and how we need to navigate and negotiate. But I think that this is possible and this can be done, but it needs to be done carefully and it needs to be done sensitively.
What an amazing response. You raised some really key issues, Mary, in terms of representation, but also I think a key thing that you throw up, you will recall from when we launched MOS at the Writers Network at the Centre for the Book in Cape Town many, many years ago. And part of sort of core and purpose of the Writers Network was to open the door for more writers to be able to be published, because the publishing industry in South Africa is very fraught. 95% of it is educational publications. Selling 5,000 novels in South Africa makes you a best-selling author. So yeah, the publishing discussion is another complex one, and who decides which stories get published, how those are disseminated is perhaps a conversation for another panel. So let me skip past myself and on to Dee. I'm very interested. Thank you, Mary. Very interested to hear your thoughts on the provocation, Dee.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ashraf, and thanks to Time of the Writer. This is a wonderful panel, and I'm very grateful to be here tonight with all of you. Thank you. And thanks to Ruth and Mary for kind of starting us out in such an exciting manner. So my provocations were around affective labor with a focus on mothering as a kind of project, right? And you were really asking me about the complexities of what are my thoughts around the kind of complexities of representations of mothers in literary examples. And, you know, Ashraf, that's a very big question. I mean, that was just unfair. So there are a few things that, there are a few things to say. So the one is, you know, when you asked me about inclusive motherhood, my immediate response was, because some of the work that I'm doing is I'm really trying to think through how do we write about mothering as a project beyond kind of narrow lens, right? Both in the kind of biological sense and in this around the kind of cultural impositions around who does a mother look like? What is a mother, right? I'm particularly interested in grappling in the terrain of race, and so really thinking about the impossibilities served to us through existing forms of theory around what is motherhood. And so I kind of take issue with the term motherhood. And so I'm playing around with notions of, do we perhaps use the verb mothering, right? Do we use the verb parenting, which of course takes it away from this assumed kind of cis-het woman's body. But I mean, really, it's a broad kind of set of considerations. So I'm interested in mothering as a verb, but I'm also interested in a kind of lexicon that's greater than just this word mother. Keeping in mind or with an awareness that mothering moves in interesting ways across race and across gender. It is both personal subjectivity, but it is also part of a collective conversation. And so I'm interested in the ways in which mothering resonates as or alongside care, whether it's radical care and I mean, I think all forms of care in some ways are radical, particularly in the kind of society in which we live, where we are very kind of isolated. But I also wanted to kind of introduce this idea, and Ruth knows a little bit about this because we've been speaking about it in relation to something else, around who else can mother, right? That mothering is not only necessarily the work of a certain kind of person or body. So perhaps the term, and I don't want to impose a term, but there are also other terms and ways in which we are nurtured and cared for that kind of flow into the maternal, but are not necessarily called mothering or motherhood. And so there are a few things that came up for me. A couple of literary texts, well, 3 literary texts. The one was Yvette Christians's Unconfessed. The other was Toni Morrison's Beloved. And then the film, Zulu Love Letter by Ramadan Suleiman and Becky Zizwe Peterson. And for me, these 3 quite different texts all intersect with notions of what it means to care, to be cared for. The figure of the mother or the work of mothering is central, but it is also infused with all kinds of other things. And a sense of the kind of out of body is very much present in each of these texts. And so I kind of wanted to bring that to this conversation, to say that mothering is all of these nurturing things, but there are also elements of madness, elements of outside of bodiness, elements of not being oneself, right? And not even recognizing oneself. And then also just to say, so the 3 kind of 3 texts that I think speak to each other in these ways that I've just described. And then there are 3 other texts that do kind of examples of, I would say, kind of post-feminist contemporary texts that ask questions about mothering or the project of motherhood that I've found quite interesting. And they are Sheila Hetty's Motherhood, which is a kind of questioning memoir around whether she, where she's asking herself, should I have children? Why have children, right? The second is, which Ruth introduced to me, is Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, which really deals with a very kind of complex terrain of transparenting and what that means. And it's just an incredible book. And Rachel Cusk's A Mother's Work, which was publicly kind of she got slaughtered for it publicly because, why speak about motherhood again? And so when you ask me what is the term?
An inclusive definition of motherhood.
Exactly. What is an inclusive definition of motherhood? These are some of the things that come not only to mind for me, but some of the things I've really been sitting with, and in quite an uncomfortable fashion, because also, of course, you're asking about, as I said in the beginning, you're not asking about mothers in the cis-het sense. You're asking about what is inclusivity when we're speaking about, when we're trying to give mothering a new name, because mothering is not only done by these particular kinds of women. And then also I was very moved by an article that Ruth shared with me recently, and I have forgotten the title, which is not very good, but I'll get it during our conversation, which really deals with Adichie's, I think it was last year or the year before, where she came out and said trans women are not women, and the kind of public discourse around that, because there's also something worth discussing there around what someone like Adichie means when she says something like that in a public terrain or on a public platform. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just chucking provocations back at you. But I think that this makes for an interesting set of considerations. So that's where I'll leave it for now.
Thank you. Those are really amazing insights, and I'm listening and sifting and absorbing quite a lot of it. Quite a lot of it lands with me, not just as a creative, I do still write, but also as somebody who co-parents 2 young girls. and they don't have a maternal figure. We are two dads. So it's in my life, it becomes a dysphoric moment for myself and for the children. And I think Ruth said this in a much more articulate way. You've indicated it as well. For me, the framework of this panel is about a certain kind of failure of the current systems, but also in your exploration of motherhood. For me, again, that particular word is traumatic because my children are adopted, and I don't know how to respond to questions around maternal figures and mothering. We do the job of parenting, and these are things that we have to navigate as a family. These are things that we have to navigate in an extended family and in the world. And every time the question comes up, motherhood as a term is a failure of language for me. And when it gets used in the cis-het conventional way, I feel excluded. I feel like language has become an instrument that cuts me out of access to life. So hence the title again. And I think everything all three of you have said really reinscribes for me my position on that and makes me consider as a creative and as a writer whether I do enough to reflect my own life and experiences. A lot of the work that I have written is kind of atavistic, is kind of attempting to excavate identity through history. But I've never really been brave enough to talk about what I'm talking about right now. And it's really great to have the three of you offer frameworks and responses in which I'm able to locate myself a lot more clearly, because often these things fly around in my head. And certainly I can say as a reader, I've not seen nearly enough or enjoyed nearly enough literature which has helped me frame a position on it, because as a writer, I grew into writing and I grew into my identity as a queer person by seeing those stories reflected back at me. And I love that you brought up the fact, Mary, that there's another key failure. It's a failure of publishing in terms of being able to develop a culture which is broad enough and inclusive enough in terms of the publishing industry to reflect all of those stories. I also love the care with which you sketch the kinds of stories that you wish to write. But let's move on from that in a minute, because I'll get lost down that rabbit hole. I would like to pose this question to Mary. So we've mentioned Moss, which is a lovely a collection of interlinked short stories set against the backdrop of Cape Town. The Jacket, the Dust Jacket, describes it as probing the occult regions of the psyche in order to expose sexuality and repression, passion and inhibition, joy and sin. Written in the voice of a girl whose father is conducting an illicit affair with her aunt, Jungfrau from the collection earned you the Cain Prize and went on to be adapted for the stage. The solitary act of reading Jungfrau and Moss was quite different to the communal experience of watching Jungfrau adapted for performance with other people, because you're witnessing and observing something that as a reader you would experience privately and process privately, and one has to, and certainly the way that Jay Bowers staged the work, there was no cross arch, there was no fourth wall, the audience wrapped the performance space, so you were literally drawn into the performance, sitting with performers sort of performing into the audience, as it were. And I also feel like the text does that because it makes you complicit in some way. But what was key and what really resonated for me in both experiences, one being private, one being public, was all of the characters' trauma and the trauma that one sort of feels drawn into, in fact, is the dramatic engine for the story, for the short story. And certainly it is how Jay deployed it in terms of making the piece work in performance. And I was very keen to know, as a writer, you know, one asks these technical questions, how much of understanding, I mean, certainly for the actors performing it, having to go back and do that every night, it's what trauma does. It reinscribes itself, it performs itself until you play it out. In writing it, was that intentional? How much of it was intentional? Have I missed the mark completely in my reading anyway?
No, I think it is a traumatic story, and I think that it is really interesting to kind of look at the difference between the short story and the stage adaptation, because the short story, it kind of gets lost. A lot of the trauma gets lost in the child's voice. So you don't really kind of get all of it because it's all kind of like lyrical and soft, and and then suddenly like at the end you kind of realize what's going on here. But when I watched the stage adaptation, I sent a message to Jade saying that's one opgefokte family, because like suddenly it's out there and it's on the stage and you can kind of see exactly the extent to which they're all, opgefok, so it was very shocking actually, and I found it slightly traumatic to watch it because I found it disturbing in a way that the story itself, obviously I wrote it so it doesn't disturb me in the same way, but when I watched it, it really felt like that trauma was kind of highlighted in a way that that plays out differently in the book, in the story anyways. But when I wrote the story, I was mostly interested in the personal relationships. It's a story I wrote a long time ago in the late 90s, I think. So in some ways it's quite a raw story. It's something that I just kind of did. It kind of flowed out of me. I was sitting in level 5 at UCT libraries and working the loans desk, because that's what was my part-time job at the time. And I started writing it, and I just basically, it kind of came out, and it's a raw story in a lot of ways. It's kind of different to how I do most of my writing, because I tend to overwork things a lot. And yeah, it just came. So I didn't really think about it that much. It just kind of came, and whatever trauma was feeding it was there. Like it's raw. So I find that it's about an intimate trauma, it's about a personal trauma, but at the same time, the personal and the social kind of play off each other. And I think that came back really nicely in the stage adaptation as well. I am really, as I said, interested in trauma and stories. And what I think where it does actually come out really intentionally is in my next book, which I can't talk about right now. And I'm really excited about that because that explores historical rage and trauma. And I'm really looking forward to being able to share details about that, because if I could talk about that now, I think it would be really interesting to consider your question in relation to that.
But I'd like to hop, since we can't talk about the next one, let's hop to the cutting room for just a minute, because
sure.
Me close out this question, because I'm very interested in performance work that does this kind of staging of trauma, and especially in the way that Jade staged Jungfrau, where an audience is just kind of left with it. It's this kind of non-consensual audience participation where you're just drawn into it, and then the house lights go down and you've got to go home. Do creatives who stage, cutting room, every chapter ends with a newspaper cutting about a crime, and it's just kind of left there. Should such novels and should such stage plays come with a trigger warning?
Interesting question, really interesting question. I think, I'm really fascinated by the ordinary cruelties of life, by the ways in which people who love each other harm each other. When I started writing The Cutting Room, I was very aware of the kind of low-level anxiety that a lot of people had because of living in a place where violent crime had become ordinary. Every time I picked up a newspaper or heard another story or had another kind of brush with crime myself, fueled that anxiety, and I really wanted to explore that through story. And I think that the question of resolution is really interesting. When I did my academic research into drama and storytelling, cases, I think that trauma resists being told through a kind of traditional 3-act narrative structure with a neat closure. I think that quite often the story fragments, or something erupts, or it won't end neatly, and something just doesn't hold. And it's really funny because I studied all this and then I kind of moved on, went away, did some other things. And then when I wrote The Wren Hunt, I was having a kind of existential crisis. I'd lost my mom. I hated being apart from my family. And I wrote that book as a way of trying to fix things. I decided that I was only going to write a book that I could write in Ireland and nowhere else. So I decided that I would write a conventional fantasy book with kissing. This was the plan. But then the book became its own thing. It became a little bit haunted by itself, and the end is really ambiguous. And there are these eruptions where the main character's lost mother appears to her, and it's never entirely explained. Can you guess who has been grieving her mother when she wrote the book? And things kind of spill out of the seams, but yet it's absolutely the book that it should be. So then again, it goes back to the idea that our experiences feed our stories, even if they transmute into something different. And whether that should come with a trigger warning, I don't know. I like to be surprised by books. I like books to kind of do things to my senses and to work in my head in a way that I don't necessarily expect. But then I have the luxury of enjoying that because I'm able to. I'm in a position. I've not experienced anything that makes me unable to deal with that. So I find personally I would prefer not to have trigger warnings, but I'm very aware that a lot of people have been asking for that, and I'm seeing that coming out a lot more often. Well, it has come out in some books that I've seen where it says kind of content warnings, this might contain this, that, whatever, so that people who are triggered by certain things might know to steer clear of them. So it wouldn't be my preference, but I really do understand that many readers have a need for it. Yeah.
I think that my takeaway from your answer, and I think you've answered, I think that people will have positions on that, is this idea of using the writing process and the creative process to transmute something that is traumatic, and perhaps that can serve as a tool for a reader in terms of processing something else. So I think that that's a useful, healthy takeaway. I mean, the trigger warnings thing is meant to be provocative. I mean, lots of lecture rooms in the US now that people are asking for certain lectures even to perhaps carry trigger warnings. There are lots of sensitivities. I just think that there's a lot more access for everybody, especially in terms of telling stories, making stories, and the kinds of discussions that we enter into. Like I wonder now in retrospect whether this panel should have come with a trigger warning.
I think, sorry, I should just interrupt you there. One of the things that some writers object to about trigger warnings is that they're spoilers. So if you say trigger warning, sexual assault, like you're kind of saying what's in the book, you know? So if that was a twist to the story or whatever, that could be complicated. I don't know. That's not my particular concern with it. But yeah, I think.
Yeah, I hear that. I wonder, Dee and Ruth, do you have thoughts? Trigger warnings on creative work? Dee, you're on mute.
Sorry. My sense is no. I think, as Mary has said, it kind of gives away a lot of what is to come, and I enjoy getting lost in the novel, or I enjoy that. So my feeling is no. I'm okay. I'm okay with not having trigger warnings, particularly for reading material. I think with other forms of I don't know about theater productions. I do get why we get some kind of warnings when it comes to cinema, because I think you are engaging in being in a space where, you may be watching in a public space, etc., and there are different ways in which people respond to violence, whether it be sexual assault or other forms of violence. I do think that there's a necessity for that. But I personally would prefer to not have a trigger warning for my books.
I think you make a really good point about that the different forms call for. I mean, absolutely. I used to work for the National Film for the Film and Publications Board, and I understood from a parenting perspective, it's really useful for parents to understand what the content is so that they can decide what's for children or not. And certainly, it used to not be a common thing in performance to have trigger warnings or sort of content warnings, but more and more, when the more experimental the work becomes, there is this. It starts treading into the terrain of where a film might be. I have sat in performances where I have felt completely shattered and unprepared and not able to deal with what has just been shared with me. And I think what's different for me, again, with Jungfrau is I wouldn't mind a not trigger warning on the book, where I might have wanted it in the performance, simply because by yourself reading the thing, you can kind of figure it out. But to know how to get up after the house lights go on, and to sort of carry on with your life and get yourself home if you've been triggered is quite a different thing. So I do think that the form has a large part in that. Dee, I want to stick with you for a minute. We've been talking about kids and motherhood and parenting, mothering as a verb. So as parents, our children may show interest in clothes or toys that society tells us are more often associated with the opposite gender, and they may appear to be unhappy with their physical sex characteristics. Apparently, this type of behavior is reasonably common in childhood and is part of growing up, and does not necessarily mean that they have gender dysphoria or other gender identity issues. Gender dysphoria, until what age is it just a phase, do you think?
I have no idea is my answer to you. Before I continue, I want to just kind of correct myself earlier. And I know that Ruth put the citation in the chat. The text that I was referring to is by B. Kamenga, and the article is called Disregard and Danger, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the Voices of Trans and Cis African Feminists. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there so nobody feels offended, because I found it to be a really wonderful and insightful and generative article speaking back to Adichie, and in a way actually also feeds into how I'm hoping to answer you. Can you hear me? It's
yes, we can hear you.
About an unstable connection. Good. Ashraf, I don't know. In my personal experience with Littlies, I've experienced both. My son has not yet, perhaps I should say, had this kind of phase. He kind of presents as very sensitive, but his interests have been very masculine from very, very early on, much to my surprise. And, you know, because I was kind of more, I just thought, you know, what is it? Nurture over nature. Yeah, nature versus nurture. I just figured, you know, if I provide him with a selection of toys and books and interesting objects, he won't lean towards being the little boy who only wants to play with trucks. But he was making the sounds for vehicles from about very, very early on. You know, we'd sit in the car and he would look out and see a truck. And I mean, that I wasn't kind of purposefully ushering that, you know, I'd give him a doll and he'd go, I don't want this. So my question is, I don't know, and perhaps that will come in a kind of personal capacity. Perhaps that will be something I experience at a later stage. Perhaps it's something I experience with the next one. It's not something that I feel concerned about, because I think, as Ruth said, you know, we do all exist on a continuum. You know, there is no boys are this way, girls are this another way, you know. And so I think in kind of staying open-minded about the fluidity, I think that opens up, I don't know, that there's an openness, that there's a realm of possibility. But I don't know, and I don't want to kind of answer in a more definitive way around, you know, this is normative or this is not normative. But I'm not sure, actually.
It's a perfectly valid response, and I was being deliberately provocative. Ruth, please go ahead.
Just picking up on some of what Dee's said, I think, but we also have, you know, even the question, at what point does it stop being a phase? Like, you know, I don't want to get too deep, but like, life is a phase, you know, nothing's infinite. I hate to break it to everyone, but like, none of us are going to be here forever, and nothing lasts forever. Yeah, so like, everything's a phase, but we're obviously kind of, you know, culturally programmed to only think of certain things as finite. You know, certain things we have to view as infinite, like cis heteronormativity, compulsory heterosexuality, that's infinite. You know, we hope we'll end up with someone happily ever after, but so even the question, like the things that we are inclined to view as a phase, because they're constructed as backward according to the logics in which we live, you know, which is basically gender and sexual diversity, I just think it's really important for us to even refuse the terms of the question.
I'm super fine with that. I'd like to segue a little bit to your work on CUPE, who at the time, way ahead of their time, was fluid and they did not identify as either male or female. According to the Gala archive and the literature there, it says that both CUPE and their friends tended to use feminine pronouns for each other. And however, again, you know, that can often be turned on its head in a traumatic sort of way, because to this day, one of the ways in which formally classified colored boys bully other formally classified colored boys perceived to be presenting as feminine is by using feminine pronouns for them. I think it's interesting that CUPE inverted that, but there's a kind of irony there. Are you able to unpack some of that?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. So yes, CUPE and her friends used she, her pronouns to refer to themselves and each other, and they identified as gay, but in their usage, gay is never attached to man or men. So they don't describe themselves as gay men, they describe themselves as gays. However, many of the people who've written about CUPE since then have described her as a gay man and referred to her as he. Now, it seems to me that this is probably not like malicious or intentionally disrespectful, but it is a very clear indication of the ways in which they read and understand CUPE, given their own interpretive frames that are available to them. You know, they see CUPE and they read her in a way that they are more inclined to describe her as a gay man and as he, him, even though she never uses that language on record to describe herself. CUPE herself actually says people can't say I'm a man, they can't say I'm a woman repeatedly, but then people do describe her as man. So I'm saying this because I think this is actually where the link comes in with the forms of bullying that you're describing, Ashraf. The forms of bullying that you're describing are basically designed to shame the person being bullied into performing their assigned masculinity correctly, right? So conveying, you know, I don't want to like over egg it, but conveying the message is something like you're too feminine to be someone with he, him pronouns. So I will use she, her pronouns to describe you and then shame you back into performing your masculinity correctly. So it's that bullying is reinscribing the alignment of sex and gender identity and gender performance. And we all know that this alignment is really damaging. This act is one type of what the trans philosopher Talia May Betcher describes as reality enforcement. She's developed this concept, and it kind of refers to the often very violent re-establishment of what is real according to compulsory cis heterosexuality. So what is real is you are assigned as male. And we see this all the time still, you know, in media coverage, particularly that really reinscribes this myth that trans people are actually pretenders or deceivers. It implies that what is real is actually the sex to which they were assigned at birth. And this reality enforcement happens in particularly violent ways to trans women, as we know. Okay, so I think this is also interesting because at the time that CUPE is living in District 6 with her friends, they are criminalized by the Disguises Act, right? So the very rhetoric that's used to criminalize them implies that they are in disguise. So the laws at this time are doing this kind of reality enforcement. They're literally saying anyone who's assigned to the male sex at birth, wearing clothing assigned female is in disguise. So being a pretender or a deceiver. But CUPE repeatedly insists that she's just her. She says, I'm just CUPE, I'm just me. People can't say I'm a man, they can't say I'm a woman. So she refuses this enforced reality and she says, this is my reality. And that's partly by what she does, but that's partly why what she does is so powerful. You know, when I was talking earlier about creating systems of possibility, this is a system that she's creating. Now, at the moment, like as we're speaking, I mean, not right now, but at this time, gender recognition legislation is being debated in the South African Parliament. And in particular, there's a proposal to introduce the X marker as not as a third gender. So the X has been introduced in certain South Asian countries, for example, as a third gender. And there's a proposal, and many trans groups and trans people in South Africa are saying that they want it to be introduced as unspecified. And I think that CUPE actually offers a historical precedent for this. So when she says people can't say I'm a man, they can't say I'm a woman, there's an openness there that she's leaving. So she's prefiguring some kind of linguistic shift that is yet to come, as would this X marker being unspecified. That's leaving space open. And, you know, I spoke about language changing quite jokingly about the Facebook wall, but also this applies to pronouns. In the English language, we've gained pronouns, we've lost pronouns. We used to have a formal version of you that we'd say. Now we only have one form of you. I think thou is the informal. So we lose pronouns all the time. We gain pronouns all the time. Well, not all the time, but it does happen. And CUPE's anticipating this kind of change potentially. And I think that what she also does by using she, her pronouns and identifying as gay, for example, is she also helps us to insist on the expansiveness of these terms that she's using. So I am a cis woman and I am gay and I use she, her pronouns, and I love being a woman and I love being gay. And that's partly because I understand the word woman, for example, and I understand my pronouns as expansive enough to hold everything that I am. And QP's someone who, you know, working on QP's archive is amazing, because she really helps me feel that every day. I don't want to go on for too long, but I do just want to comment on the fact that I'm in the UK at the moment. I'm doing my PhD here. You know, there's this very aggressive rise of TERFs, of trans exclusionary radical feminists who describe themselves as gender critical. And one thing they often talk about is how dangerous it is for people to be exposed to this like ideology, because they might think they want to transition early in life and actually they might be mistaken. And there's like no evidence to back this up, that this is actually a danger to any of us. And I always think when I hear them say this, but I'm so grateful that I live in a world in which being trans is possible, and that I'm been able to like explore my own identity in relation to the set of terms that are available. Like my experience of being a woman and of using she, her pronouns is so much richer because of this wealth of experiences and knowledge that I'm able to understand as able to be housed within these terms that I identify with in my kind of own unique way. So yes, I would say that the bullying you're describing is an act of reality enforcement, which we see all the time, and we can think about happening to QP at that time. And I think that QP is like, I don't know what we describe it as, but whatever the opposite of reality enforcement is, she's like a reality expander, something like that.
I think that's a really great note to segue from for closing thoughts. But before we do the closing thoughts, Mary, I think that you're a reality expander. It's why I enjoy reading your work. You always have been in that sort of way. Your work is expansive. I'm fangirling, so I'll stop. I just want to acknowledge Lorraine Sitole on Facebook, who says they never really gave thought to the singular they till now. We learn new things every day. Thank you for that, Lorraine. And to Mikhail Pepas, who says valuable insights into mothering and the quest to evolve a new name for the traditional term. So thank you to everybody out there listening to us. We have just a few minutes left, and I want to offer the panelists either the opportunity to have a closing remark or to ask another panelist a question. And the first shot goes to you, Mary Watson.
Have
I caught you off guard?
I have loads of questions, but I can't think of them right now. Like everything is still kind of settling, but I am absolutely stimulated by what I've heard from all of you this afternoon, and you know, it's been really useful for me to listen, and I have questions and I will have questions. I can't think of them right now, and if you find me sort of getting in touch and saying, but what about this, then please don't think that I'm a bit of a stalker or anything like that. No, I mean, I think what has been really interesting for me, particularly about this discussion this afternoon, is how we've all kind of come from quite different angles around a particular topic and with very different perspectives, but it's been really interesting to see how they kind of cohere when put together in a kind of montage form. Like I really enjoyed that. So I suppose all I have to say is thank you.
Thank you, Mary Watson. DeMarco, any final thoughts from you?
I, like Mary, have lots of things in my head, but I need a moment to have also have them settle, and the things I want to go back to. I suppose I just wanted to say also thank you, and that I think, as Mary's saying, it's really interesting actually having put the three of us together, because there is a way in which you know, there have been interesting intersections, I think, across our different works. But also just to say that I think this element of trauma, that there's really so much there to grapple with, you know, in relation to this terrain of mothering, in relation to QP and others like QP in the context of then and now, in relation, I imagine, to characters in Mary's books, and others. So I just think that the subject is so big, and we could just go on and on, really. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. Ruth, any final thoughts?
Thanks. I have a lot of final thoughts, but I'm going to limit myself to something for each of you. Mary, I'm really interested in this question that you raised about being inclusive as an author with your own set of experiences and representing trans characters, for example. And it's got me thinking about, the role of the writer, but also whether the question has to be about representing characters or whether it could be so much richer than that, about what writers do and how that opens up other possibilities, but also about how we might engage with, existing models for working with minoritized groups in order to improve the representation of those groups. Like, I'm sure we don't need to invent the wheel from scratch with this. So that is something I'd love to think about further. And Ashraf, thank you for sharing your own experiences in relation to this word mother earlier. And I wanted to add to that part of the reason I'm so excited about this work Dee's doing with the term mothering is that I think part of what it helps us do is be cognizant of the fact that our conception of parenthood is already really expansive. We think about now, of course, there are non-binary people and trans men who are pregnant with children, give birth to those children, and are not those children's mothers. And people are like, but how? How is this? But actually, our conception of parenthood is already expansive. We have adoptive parents. We have parents who don't give birth to their children and are parents. We don't go to them and say, you're not. The myth of the nuclear family is actually not a good representation of how we think about parenting to begin with. Before there were, people had two dads because those dads were in a relationship. People might have had two dads because, their mother divorced and remarried. People have always had, this has always been bigger than we think. But the issue of mothering in particular, I think, is important because it helps us see that this work happens in so many more ways than just by family of origin mothers. I mean, QP describes herself as a queen mother to all the gays, and she clearly mothers them. And this, I think it's not so much like coming up with a more expansive definition of mothering or parenting, so much as it is seeing the ways that the definition is already expansive and it's already been inhabited in extremely expansive ways by many. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you to all three of you. We have 1 minute. I'm going to steal that minute for myself and just share as a closing thought what I found to be a really powerful, super simple quote. 13-year-old activist Avery Jackson was the first transgender person to be featured on the cover of National Geographic. There were 9 at the time, and this is what they said. "The best thing about being a girl is now I don't have to pretend to be a boy," which I just thought was lovely and liberating, and a lovely crystallization of all of the chaos in my head around this particular topic, which the three of you have helped unravel. So I am very grateful to you, Mary Watson, for always having been there, for showing up today. So lovely to meet you, Ruth. I think I'm in love with your mind. That doesn't mean that I'm not in love with your mind, Dee. I love being in this world. I love having these conversations. Thank you. This could have been around a dinner table, and I think that's what this panel was framed as. I certainly had a great time, and I've loved listening to you. Terima kasih. And I think that's it from all of us. We gotta go. Thank you to the people